Hi. So this is my interpretation of Excel report number one and all six scenarios. So scenario number one talks about relativity and number density. For my universe storyboard, I basically chose one item that was less than the diameter of 1 meter, one item that was about comparable, and then one that was much greater. And I also chose these items because they were relevant. I felt like they were pretty important, or at least important to me. So I chose the carbon atom, the water molecule, the water molecule, not the carbon atom. I chose the water molecule, which is less than a diameter or 3.3 feet. And I chose it because water obviously is extremely important. It's vital. We drink it every day. Our earth is made up of it. It's super important. I chose the sunflower because, well, I really love flowers. But I also thought it was really interesting that the sunflower isn't just one flower, it's a lot of little flowers that make up one flower. And it's about comparable to 1 meter. It's 2.5 meters, so about 3 meters. So it's about comparable to a diameter, to the diameter of 1 meter, sorry. And then the Earth, which is obviously much bigger. So the Earth is 12,700 kilometers. And I chose it because obviously we live on Earth, is super important, but I really like the information provided for it. It said the Earth is our only home. While living on it, we may consider it huge, but it is still important to take care of it. When it is gone, there will be nowhere else left to go. And I just found that really profound. There's kind of like this running joke on the internet that when global warming overtakes, the rich is gonna like pack up and go to Mars. But obviously that may not be as viable as option as people think it is. So why not just take care of the planet that we have now, that we're living on now? So the objective of scenario number one was to decide how fast we were actually moving. And the scale of the universe is measured by the diameter of 1 meter, or 3.3 feet. So basically, anything greater than 1 meter is considered larger. Anything less than 1 meter is considered smaller. And that's just kind of how we, I guess, measure the universe. So here we have this table that talks about, it shows body movements, the speed of those body movements in miles per hour, and then that speed in scientific notation. Now, the reason why we can't feel or notice how fast we're moving, because we're moving really fast, is because we move at the same rate as Earth moves. We don't move any faster or any slower. So we don't really notice that we're moving very fast. And so the way that we can figure out just how fast we're moving is by comparing Earth to things outside of it, comparing the speed. So here we have body movements. We have Earth's rotation, we have Earth's orbit, solar system, the galaxy speed, Milky Way orbit, and then the local group speed. And all that together tells us that we're moving almost 8 million miles per hour, which is very fast. We see here in the pie chart that the local group speed has the biggest portion of it. And that's because the local group speed represents the supercluster. All of it is combined. Earth's rotation, Earth's orbit, the solar system, we're all a part of that. It's not happening, individually. That all adds up and we're a part of all that movement. And so that is considered like the local group speed. So when you add all of that up, you get this total, and it takes up the largest amount. And then we see that represented here in the bar chart. The local group speed takes up most of it, and then Earth's rotation is barely visible right here. So that's, that's really interesting. Moving on to scenario number 2, which talks about misleading data. This was actually my favorite scenario to do. Basically, this talks about how bias and biased data in falsified reports can be identified. Here we have, for our first charts, we have Clinton and Bush and their unemployment rate percentages when they were in office. From the table alone, you see that they're not too far apart. Clinton has 5.2%, Bush has 5.8%, which is about 5.2%. But here in the adjusted chart, the first chart here on the left, it shows that Clinton is way higher than Bush in terms of unemployment rate. The reason for that is because the chart does not include zero. The chart has been adjusted to include the very minimum and very maximum value of the data being presented. So when we look at the adjusted chart on the right and we include zero, we see that there is really no difference in percentage, which you would notice here on the table. There's only like a 2% difference. So that's one way that data can be biased and falsified, is by not including that zero on the y-axis. Coming down here to the bowlers and bowling scores, just looking at the table alone, we have Diana, Howard, and Emily. Diana has 120, Howard, or Hild maybe, has 112, and Emily has 126. Just looking at the table alone, there's not really too much of a difference. Emily is leading a very modest lead. But when you look at the adjusted bowling scores here, graph on the left, Emily looks like she's just miles ahead away from Howard and Diana. Howard, certainly. But when you again adjust the chart to include zero, you see that there's not really that much of a difference. There's maybe, there's less than a 20% difference here between Hild and Emily. So you see that it's important to include that zero, because from an illustrative standpoint, these graphs portray something that just it's not real. When you come down to the arena funding, which is this pie chart here on the right, this is the adjusted chart. So we have the table here on the far left about the contributors and then the amount they've contributed in millions. So for the city contributed a very considerable amount. They contributed 265 million. So they get half of the chart. That seems about right. But then you come to unknown, that's contributed about 10 million. And they get a pretty decent part of that pie as well. And then the Maloofs contributed a whopping 85 million. They also get a decent portion of the chart. And then you have AEG that contributed 50 million. Well, what's off about this chart is that, so the city takes up half because they've contributed the most. But these contributors over here, this pie represents an almost equal contribution for these other three contributors. And that's not true. 10 million is nothing like 85 million. That's quite a bit of difference. But if you look at the slice of these pies, they're almost equal. So when you take that information and we put it over here in this pie chart, you get a more realistic deviation of contributions. So the city obviously takes up more than half of the pie. There's 65%. Then Maloofs that contributed the second most, they take in a good portion. That's 21%. And then AEG takes up that 50 million, 12% here. And then the unknown with the 10 million, you see that's barely 2%. That's a very, very small percentage of that pie. And that's how it should have looked on this pie. Because again, 10 million is nothing like 265, 85, or 50 million. That was a very adjusted way of putting this pie. It's not accurate. When we come down here to another pie chart about companies and then their percent of sales, here we have the adjusted chart. We have all these companies, ACC TED, ACC SAN, ACC Gas, Ultros, ACC GAM, ACC PASS, and then you have this peculiar Cartera in the middle. This is an interesting way to put a pie, to make a pie chart, because here we see from the table that the greatest percent of sales is ACC PASS with 24%, and that's represented over here. The second lowest is Ultros, 9%, which is represented here. But then you have Cartera, which gives the very lowest percent of sale at 4.5%, but it gets an equal measurement in the pie. There's no real way to measure this. There's no, it's not an accurate representation of how much sells of its sales. So when we go to the chart that was created, we see that Cartera rightfully has a very small piece of the pie, and ACC PASS has a good portion of it. And then, you know, on so with the other percent of sales. But this is a very peculiar way to make a pie. It almost just shows that this Cartera here has an equal portion, and it doesn't. It has a very small portion, which we see when we take it and we put it into the diameter of this pie, of the circle of this, when we put it into this circle. Now mine's look kind of oval shaped, but it, you know, the sentiment is the same. It takes up a very small percentage of the pie. We see 13.7% of the gray circle in the blue circle. The blue represents the area of the whole pie. The gray circle represents the Cartera. That's a very small percentage. Moving on to our third scenario, which is, sorry, I have to move this over a little bit. Probabilities and populations. So the objective of this scenario was to determine the Americans' population and the rate of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and high blood pressure, and the probability of having all three and some combination of the three. So here we see that Americans' population is roughly 329 million and counting. And on this chart, which has the same values, we see that we have 329 million Americans total. Of that 329 million, 95.4 have obesity, 34.5 have type 2 diabetes, 107.6 have high blood pressure, and then we have a combination of the two. With type 2 diabetes and obesity, 31.1, type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure, 31.1, obesity and high blood pressure, 82, type 2 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, obesity, and high blood pressure, 28 million. And that's also translated here in the Venn diagram. The Venn diagrams will illustrate the way these cross and the probability of having all three or a combination of the three. So here we come down to the Venn diagrams. Now, these boxes around represent the universe, and they also represent the Americans that don't have any. So we have that here in numbers, and we also have it in percentages. So there are 201.7 Americans that do not have obesity, type 2 diabetes, or high blood pressure, and that's also represented here in the 63.1%. So looking at the Venn diagram, 10.2 million Americans have obesity or are obese. 22.4 have high blood pressure. 0.3 have type 2 diabetes. And you can see that over here on the chart. You can see that represented here on the chart. Without 207.6. Obesity. You can see that represented here on the chart. Sorry. So now we need to see the combination of all three. 28 million, you can see here in these little subsections, 28 million have all three. They have obesity, type 2 diabetes, and high blood pressure. 54.1 million Americans have obesity and high blood pressure, and 3.1 million have obesity and type 2 diabetes, and then another 3.1 have high blood pressure and type 2 diabetes. So this is a really good illustration of what Americans have either or, and then what don't have anything at all. And if we were to say, okay, what would be our chances of having or being obese or having a combination of the three or having all three, the adult obesity rate by state is a good way to determine that. Arkansas is ranked 7 in terms of the highest body mass index, which is pretty high. And just from that alone, we can understand that we're more susceptible to obesity. And then these other health conditions are closely related, like type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure. So there's a good chance that if you come from a state that has a really high BMI rate, there's a good chance of being obese. And then there's a good chance, and honestly, I really don't like that word, but there's a good chance of being obese, and then there's a good chance of having type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure. So I would say your chances are pretty high. And I know from experience, like I have a sister who has high blood pressure, but she does not have obesity or type 2 diabetes. I do have people who are obese and have type 2 diabetes, and then I do know people who have all three. So that's a pretty good, accurate indication. And then I also noticed that a lot of the southern states here in purple have higher BMIs, and then over here in the west, they have lower BMIs. I really wonder what the correlation to that is. But that's a pretty cool representation. Moving on to scenario 4. Sorry, let me move this off the way. So scenario number 4 is measures of center and distribution. And that basically just means how data is being distributed on a graph. And so the data here being presented is Army recruits BMIs compared to random mall shoppers BMIs. And up here in the columns on the charts, we have the range, median, mean, standard of deviation, and coefficient of variation. The median is obviously the middle number or the average. The mean also represents the average. And then the standard of deviation and the coefficient are actually very similar. The standard of deviation is just basically how, sorry, I wrote it down here. I just want to say this right. So the standard of deviation is just the measured spread of data, and it basically quantifies the amount of variation or dispersion of a set of data values. So basically, it's just going to calculate how much the data being presented deviates from the general or the expected or the norm. So when looking at the Army recruits BMIs, here we have a median of 19.8, a mean of 20, a standard deviation of 3.4, and a coefficient of variation of 171. We can see from the trend line, which is just like, sorry, I wrote that down too. I just want to say it right, which indicates the general course or tendency of a data set. We can see that this is a normal set of data because of how closely the plots or how tight the data is to the trend line. The average of BMIs are very close. The highest is 25.7. The lowest is here is 14. And it's just it's a very tight trend. Nothing deviates too far. And the standard deviation is quite small. It's only like 3.5. When you look over at the random mall shoppers BMI, you have the median, which is about 28 or 29, the mean 33, 34, and the standard deviation is 17, which is pretty high. When you look at the scatter plot chart, you see that the plots are pretty scattered from the trend line, which makes sense because this is a random mall shoppers BMI. It's not as specific as finding the BMI of an Army recruits. So you expect that, but then you have this value up here, this one plot point that strays very far from the rest, and it's this 72.5 here, and this is called an outlier. And an outlier is just basically a value in a set of data that strays, that's too high or too low from the median value. So it makes the chart inaccurate, and it makes it unusable. So when you come down here, we have the same information, but it's conveyed in box plots. So here in these box plots for the Army recruits BMI scores, you have these little lines here called whiskers, and the whiskers just represent the very maximum and minimum value of a set of data values. So here on the table, we have the Army recruits BMIs from the greatest to the lowest value, 25.7. You can see that represented here with the top whisker, that's about 25.7. And then down here, we have 14.1, which also is represented by the lower whisker. And then here we have the box. In the box, you can see this little line here, and that line represents the median. And the box itself, the top box and the lower box represents the upper and lower quartile range, which is just basically the highest maximum range of the median and the lowest minimum range of the median. So here we have the upper quartile range is 21.4, and you can see that represented here with this top box, with this top line, that's about 21.4. And then with the lower box, you can also, which is 19.1, you can also see that represented here on the graph. I'm recording this video. I can't have anyone. You can also see that represented for the lower quartile range, the 19.1. So that's really cool. And then when you come over here to look at the mall shoppers BMIs, you can already tell that there's some issues here. For one, you can see that outlier up there at the top, which is that 72.5 indicated right here in red. You can see that. And then you can kind of tell by the box that the median has been affected, because that line, it doesn't go through the box evenly. So you can tell that the median has been affected by this outlier. So here we have, again, the BMI is ranged from the highest to the lowest value. So, but not including the 72.5. So we have the highest value in the normal range is 45.7. You can see that reflected here at the top with the top whisker. And then you can see the lowest value, 60.8, represented down here with the bottom whisker. And then you see the median going through the box right here. And then you have the upper quartile range, 32.5. That's kind of represented here. Again, it doesn't seem that accurate. And then you have the lower quartile range, 26.4, and that's also being represented here. So that's interesting. And then again, you have this outlier up here at the top. So this would be a normal chart if not for that outlier. And then moving down here, this is just showing how a regular graph, like a normal set of data would look like. You can see from you can tell this is a normal range of data because it's even on all sides, and then there's a single peak. There's a single peak. So you can tell that this is a normal range of data, and then you can also see that here at the bottom. For our fifth scenario, we're talking about investment, sales, and profits, and we're seeing a business model through Elon Musk. So for the first graph here, for this standard sales and profits chart, we see here in the table, we have how many sales, and then we have the profits of those sales. So we know that the profit is dependent on the sales, or that the y-axis is dependent on the values of the x-axis. So here on the graph, on the line graph, you see the line starts at 0, 0, and that's the initial investment, getting the company started. And then you see this growing trend here. So for every sale, we see a steady increase in profits, and that's just for what a standard business model would look like. So moving down to Elon Musk's flamethrower business venture, we see that the graph starts at 0, and then the profit here is a negative 1,200. That typically represents, obviously, the initial investment and the money that had to be put in to the business to make it viable. So from like 0 to about 80, you see a negative amount of money being made, even though these sales are being made. And that's because there's the sales being made, the profit from these sales are being put back into the company to make it sustainable. There's no real money being made. They're just trying to keep it afloat at this point. And then here we get down to the bottom, the vertex here, where the company like hits its bottom line at 100 sales. This is the bottom line for this flamethrowing venture. And then the company eventually starts to break even. We see that at about 200 sales, not exactly 200 sales, $7,000 is being made. And then you go down, from the table. When you go down from the table, you see that at about 300, that's quite a bit of money. That's almost 200,000. But prior to that, it took about $300 to be, or 300 sales to be made for the company to make about $90,000. So we see where the company starts, we see its bottom dollar, we see where it breaks even, and then we start to see a steady incline. This becomes a successful business venture for Elon. Now, these tables here represent interest based on investors. Here we have, from this table, we have the years. We have simple interest based on annual yearly rate, and then we have continuous compound or compound interest. Now, simple interest is when you make a principal investment and you only have to pay on that principal investment. For compound interest, you not only put in the principal investment, but every year you pay on more interest. So it increases. You're not just paying on the principal interest, you're paying on the interest that occurs every year. And then you can see these two options represented on this graph. Obviously, the compound interest investment makes money more quickly. You can see that here in this neon blue. It's making a greater amount of money at a quicker rate. And then the simple interest, it makes less money, but at a more steady rate. And so let's say if I was Elon's manager and he was thinking about investors, I would actually suggest for him to go with the simple interest investment, because this is already a very successful business venture. He doesn't really need the investment. They call the simple interest the more friendly loan because you only have to pay on the principal investment. And I think that if he just wants to diversify or incorporate more people into this business, that's great. But there's no need to do the compound interest because this is an already successful business venture. And let's say, for argument's sake, if this company did start to decline or wasn't making as much sale and as much profits, that's a way more money to pay back to his investors. So I would just tell him to go with the simple interest. For scenario number 6, which is the 5-year financial plan. So if in 5 years, I graduate from college, I graduate from law school, this is my storyboard. This is what the fruits of my labor would look like. So here we have a modern craftsman bungalow. I absolutely adore these. I think that they're very homey and they're just very charming and they look just beautiful in the fall. Like, this is just, I love that. And my ideal car would be just a Nissan Maxima. It doesn't even have to be like a brand new model. I just really love the look of that car. And over here again, this is just lawyer symbols. You have the gavel and the weights, the scales, and then the brief, and yeah. So this is what my career, my financial status would look like in 5 years. And so coming over to these tables, based on my level of education in 5 years, and being either an entry-level lawyer or a junior lawyer, my gross salary would be about $72,000 a year. And I don't know if I would be married or anything like that by now, so I'm just using my own salary. Coming down here for the monthly expenses, I added and took away some things. Like, I added internet and TV. I added beauty, which is really just like hygienic purposes. I added medical and dental, emergency, I think, and other entertainment. For internet and TV, I think that'd be about $200. Groceries, 200. Now for the mortgage, so the average amount of money for a two-bedroom and a two-bathroom bungalow here in Arkansas would be about $185,000. And I didn't like take off the 20% off top. So my mortgage, my monthly mortgage would be about $965. For taxes, I got 1,734, and that's because on the federal tax bracket, I'm at 0.22, and for the state, 0.69, and that together got me about 1,734. When I for here for savings, I only have about $80. I would obviously want that to be more. And then medical and dental, I have healthcare coverage, but it doesn't cover dental. And, if you're paying out of pocket for dental, just the examination and like a pull will run you $160 just for starters. So that's why I put that there. And then I put for emergency $100 because honestly, if you're having an emergency, like no emergency is cheap. Otherwise, it wouldn't be an emergency. And then for other entertainment, I have $100. All of that together is $4,484. That's what my monthly expenses would look like in 5 years. So I took the monthly income, which I divided by 12 and got 6,000. And then the monthly expenses, 4,484, and that gave me a difference of 1,516, which obviously isn't too shabby. That's really good. I don't even know if that would be like accurate, but that would definitely be ideal. And then you see that reflected in the pie and the bar graph. So in my pie, obviously the taxes takes up a very big portion, and then the mortgage, and then everything else is fairly even, which I think is good. Um, Coming down to health and nutrition. So I decided to do my health and nutrition servings of nutritional food groups on a weekly basis based on 2 to 3 meals a day. So I did not do the weekly and the hourly. I just did mine on a weekly basis based on food servings. And so my general rule of nutrition is intermittent fasting and carb cycling, namely because I have IBS, which is irritable bowel syndrome, and these two methods together really keep me regulated, and I don't have as many episodes and discomfort. So intermittent fasting is basically when you eat for a certain amount of hours and then you stop eating for the rest of those hours. I'm on an 8 to 16 schedule, which is I have a window to eat for 8 hours and I fast for the other 16, and that really helps my digestive system. And over here, I did 2 to 3 meals a day because obviously that's kind of a tight window to eat, and I don't always get the 3 meals plus snacks that it's always being preached to have a rounded diet. So this is based on 2 to 3 meals a day. And over here, I actually follow this married couple. They're like licensed nutritionists and fitness experts, Daniel and Kelly Segers, and they have this company called Fitness Blender. They have like over 500 free videos on YouTube that you can watch. And they also have personalized plans that you can buy for like $14. And then they have like just a well of nutritional programs and tips and advice. And they're also really cost conscious. They have like eating clean on a budget for college students. And I just generally like their philosophy. They don't believe in cutting out food groups. They just think you should have a well-rounded diet. And so this is what my table reflects, their nutritional philosophy. So the food groups here are vegetables, fruits, lean meats, protein sources, healthy fat sources, grains and legumes, sweet sugar, and then I have down here miscellaneous and treat days because I kind of I swear by the 80-20 rule. I think that 80% of the time, you just kind of got to do what you got to do. You got to work out. You got to, eat healthy, nutritious. But then, sometimes it's just about enjoying yourself. So I have that reflected here in my table. For vegetables, I have 14 servings, and that's based on 2 servings on a weekly basis. Like I said, I don't always get the 2 to 3 meals, but I always try to have vegetables every day. Now, fruits, I probably eat way too many fruits, honestly. And I get a serving of fruit regardless if it's with a meal or not. So I have 21 servings, and that's based on technically 3 meals. Um, on 7 days. And then I have lean meats and protein sources. I have 18 servings, healthy fats, 12. The grains and legumes, like I said, I do carb cycling. So this is a small serving. So how carb cycling works is you eat more carbs on days that you have higher levels of activity. And then on days when you're more sedentary, you eat lesser carbs and you up your protein and your fat intake. And so I don't get very many days of high carb. So this is just a reflection of that. I get six servings a week or 6 servings based on a couple of days. And then here we have sweets and sugar, which is just like 2 servings. I try not to eat a lot of like processed sugar and all that, but I do eat like dark chocolate. So it's a representation of that. And then again, you have the miscellaneous and treat days. Now I can go weeks without having a treat day or whatever, but if I did, it would be just a couple times a week, if that. It doesn't happen very often. And so for my activity schedule, I decided to do my daily activities based on 24 hours instead of like weekly activities based on that hourly schedule, just because I wanted a good reference of exactly what amount of time I dedicate to activities a day. So this was just education for myself. So here on this table, we have sleeping. I gave 6 hours. I honestly need more sleep. I do not sleep very well. And then for eating, I have 3 hours. Workout, I have an hour, but honestly, that can be either or. Sometimes I only work out about 30 minutes. Sometimes I go over an hour. That can be adjusted. Hygiene, like washing my face, showering, that type of thing, that probably takes about 2 hours. And then like getting ready for the day. Homework and study, I have that at like 6 hours, but again, that can be adjusted. Sometimes I spend 8 hours, 9 hours on homework. It depends on what it is. Daily chores, that's just about an hour. Laundry, vacuuming, dishes, taking out trash. That doesn't take much. I'm not really a dirty person or anything. And then social media, which I'm not really proud of, but I have here about 2 hours. It can get away from you. It can. And then relaxing and fun. Now I have that at 2 hours, but honestly, I like to dedicate days to like relaxation and fun, like planning activities. So like working during the week and then like having a day on the weekend to just kind of go and do something. But if we're doing it on a daily schedule, I gave it about 2 hours, and that would just represent like watching a television program, talking to somebody on the phone, um, going outside, hanging out with friends, anything like that. That may take 2 hours. It honestly may not, but I have it here represented. And then getting ready for bed an hour, and that all totals to about a whole 24 hours. And you see that reflected here in the pie chart. The biggest slices of my pie is sleeping and schoolwork, and that's pretty accurate, although I wish I could get more sleep. Um, and just looking at that, looking at how I spend my time on a daily basis, I definitely want to minimize my usage of social media. So that was good for that. What I've learned about the differences in pay versus the cost of living is that they're always going to be comparable. Like you're always, especially because of taxes, you're always going to spend about as much money as you make. I didn't know this, but a lot of the taxes are based on, I want to say this right, so I'm going to go down here. A lot of it is based on a graduated rate system, which means that obviously the more money you make, the more of your money is being taxed. Now, places like Kansas has a three tax bracket system, which isn't as flexible, and places like California has a 10 bracket system, which allows more room for flexibility. But regardless, because I mean, the cost of living in California is super high. So whether you're being taxed more or less, you're still going to be spending a lot of money. Even like when I said that what you make and what you spend is comparable, when we looked at like the median value of homes given an area, like I looked at West Little Rock 7227, and the average home there is like 186,000. So you'd have to be making about 80 to 100,000 to even afford the cost of living there. So it is important to budget because you're never going to have as much money on hand as you think, even if you make a decent amount of money. So it definitely puts into perspective that budgeting, no matter what your tax bracket is, no matter how much money you're making, it's always a smart thing to do because you're always going to spend about as much as you make. Um, so that's that. Thank you very much.